Hey, everybody, this is Wake Up Call Live. I'm your host, Christina Previtt, and joining me once again today is immigration and human rights attorney Jessica Smith Bobadilla, who is based in California. She is going to give us an update from our last conversation about Afghan refugees, is what I'm calling them now. And you can kind of elaborate more on the terminology, but what new is going on that we can do as Americans for Afghan refugees? That's the question. Thank you, Jessica,
Right.
for joining us.
Thank you, Christina, for having me again. And, I don't think anyone is surprised that's been following this issue at all or the news at all in the last few weeks that the situation remains dire for the civilians of Afghanistan. And since we last talked, there's been loss of life, both of U.S. citizens and U.S. personnel and Afghan citizens. As a result of kind of the transformation the country is going through in relation to the US pulling out forces. In terms of the human rights situation, I understand that getting to the airport has become an increasingly dangerous and unclear type of activity in Kabul, in Afghanistan, that many people have been ambushed by the Taliban, either on the way to the airport, near the airport, or by other armed groups. We don't know if it's all just per se Taliban. There's ISIS operating there, right? There's other groups that may have an interest in not letting people leave the country, particularly if they're departing to the West, right? So there's that. There's reports of people trying to get out and get into Pakistan, where UNHCR, which is again the branch of the UN that deals with refugees, the High Commissioner on Refugees, is operating. And so some people are receiving instructions or attempting to get to Pakistan and connect with UNHCR, which is an agency of the UN that then can connect people not just with migration to the US or Europe, but sometimes settles refugees in third countries where they eventually remain. Other countries where they either stay for a duration while they try to complete an immigration process in one of the countries that's more traditionally receptive to refugees, the US, Canada, and Western Europe or Australia being what comes to mind. Or in some cases, people do settle in other countries that wouldn't typically be thought of as refugee receptor countries, right?
Yeah.
That's also something that's going on. But many people are also afraid to try to get into Pakistan because they're afraid they'll be somehow ambushed at the border or on the road, to get out, or just stopped, maybe even killed. So there's a lot of different things going on that are pretty confusing, especially in terms of advising people. And I've been involved in assisting. One case pro bono, had been in the retention process for another case. And some of the questions I'm getting are pretty hard to answer right now. In the case that I was advising for pro bono, they started right away, and did get an approval by email for a P2 visa, right, which is a kind of a designated refugee class. That's something that's come up recently. And but then we're told to wait, it appears, and are not yet told when they'll go to the airport, and are also concerned about getting to the airport or actually getting on a plane if they get to an airport at the right time.
So the last time we spoke, you said that the appropriate action would not be to wait in Afghanistan and make an application here, that you would have to leave the country. And then once you get to the United States, then you can make that application for asylum. So has that changed at this point? Or is that the same?
Well, see, traditional asylum, which isn't something that's specifically been carved out for Afghans, it's something you can apply for. If you're Mexican, if you're Canadian, technically you can apply. I don't know if you'd have a good chance of getting it if you're Canadian, but you can apply from origin of any country in the world, having any citizenship or nationality. You can present at a U.S. border and go through an application process. So that's what we discussed more in the past, right? But the US has rolled out, we talked a little bit about the special visa. It was about 10 days ago, I think that you and I went live last, right? A week to 10 days ago. And at that time, they were mostly pushing the special visa. It's called special immigrant visa for certain Afghan nationals, or something very close to that. And what that visa involves, you can apply from Afghanistan. There's also no indication that if you can prove you are Afghani, either through your Afghani passport, if you have one, or there's an identity document called tezkera, which is like a birth or family record. If you have either of those, you should be able to apply from any country in the world, accessing the consulate services. But what that visa involves, and we got into this a little bit, was people that either worked for the US Special Forces or in either directly for a US government agency, or were subcontracted, or were working, as I think they put it in this announcement, in cooperation with. So that would be like someone that might have run a nonprofit in Afghanistan that received funds from USAID, right, which is the development agency, or received funds from some other US government or military. That would be like the in cooperation with. Other people that would qualify for this visa were directly employed. And the way that people get it is that there's first something called a chief of mission approval. They want the actual documentation up front that you were, or someone in the family was employed or subcontracted. And there's a number of steps just at the outset. But there's no indication that for that visa, which is again not traditional asylum, general asylum, which is mostly what we discussed before, right? That you have to be in Afghanistan, or you definitely don't have to be at a US border. You could apply from Afghanistan. There's nothing that I'm reading or have heard that suggests you couldn't apply from any country in the world if you could prove your Afghan identity.
Okay, so it's not that you have to be in the US. You just at this point, you would just need to leave Afghanistan.
I mean, I think that's prudent just for safety for anyone who can. But then again, in these situations, we often see too that people that sometimes try to leave at either the wrong time or just end up in an inopportune situation, end up in these, road stops, ambushes by these armed groups, whether they be the Taliban, ISIS, or other sympathizers or other groups maybe that want to harm people.
Now, you had indicated to me that there were some changes just in the short time that I had you on, like 7 to 10 days ago. Can you talk more about that?
Right. So after you and I talked, the special immigrant visa, which would cover people again that were either employed by a US government agency or were somehow connected to, let's say, subcontracted, either US government or military between a certain date in 2001, and they extended it all the way to 2023, to a certain date in 2023, meaning that as we wind this up, right, there's still going to be people that might have been involved, but they have to have proved involvement. I believe it's for a year. So that still stands, which we discussed. But since then, the State Department started announcing more about a special designation of refugee type status called P2 visa for Afghans that would be similar to asylum, but that would cover more Afghans that might not exactly be covered through that special visa. Either maybe they're, at enhanced risk because they're from a certain tribe, right? That's disfavored now as this all shifts. Maybe they're disfavored because somehow they have expressed an interest in Christianity or some other religion, right? That's not Islam. So those people, if there was any idea that they could suffer because of some connection to the US, either real or perceived, that they could document, can apply for this P2 visa, which is broader. It could also be people that maybe were involved in a project with the US government or US military, but maybe it was a 3-month deal, right? Maybe it wasn't a year long, but they're still known to have been connected to the US government. So that P2 visa would be for people that are at enhanced risk, right? But that can't meet the criteria for the special visa for Afghans, which was the category that we discussed last week, besides just traditional asylum. Apart from that, a broader category that's existed under U.S. law for some time, but the State Department and USCIS, the branch of the Immigration Service that deals with benefits, have flagged that humanitarian parole, which is a way which our government can parole people into the country for a humanitarian crisis or purpose. It doesn't have to be something like a country going through this type of civil war like transformation. Or it can be other things. I recall a case where I got humanitarian parole for a mother and her daughter who had the sister of the mother, I believe. It was an adult daughter that came in with her, and their relative had been killed by her husband in the Central Valley of California, like publicly, like at a store or something. It was a long history of, I think, domestic violence in that relationship that resulted in their relative being murdered. They had no other way to immigrate, and they didn't have visas. But we filed. I was working with them and someone else that was already here. There were 3 minor children that needed them to care for them. So the U.S. government paroled this mother and adult daughter in for a year to take care of these children that were U.S. citizens. So it's any kind of like extreme humanitarian purpose it can be used for. Now, what the U.S. government is saying is that once those people are paroled in, then they can file for asylum, or maybe there could be a new pathway kind of carved out. The thing that's tricky about humanitarian asylum is that there is a $575 filing fee per person. And that generally needs to be sent off, at least within the United States. Although I think that they're trying to open up different channels. There's a lockbox in Dallas that all of these types of petitions go to. The other thing that's a little limiting about humanitarian parole, although it could be broader than either the special immigrant visa or this new P2 variant, and wouldn't require that the person is at a U.S. border presenting themselves like traditional asylum, is that it requires generally an affidavit of support. So it requires a different affidavit of support than what you apply for when you're coming in, like through a spouse or something. But it's called an I-134, which is generally used for certain types of non-immigrant status that require an affidavit of support or financial backing. So that means that someone has to be here that is willing to back them financially as a sponsor. And that does require that the person is on the hook for 10 years financially. So it's usually going to be a relative who's a U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident who has substantial income to support the person getting humanitarian parole.
What about just the average ordinary citizen there who didn't have any connections to the US or the government or any special projects that they were working on? What
I
is their
think
recourse?
so. I think even humanitarian parole would be very difficult for them because they would be unlikely to prevail well, first of all, usually most humanitarian parole cases that I've heard of that have been approved, did require some documentation as to why this case is special. Now that could be a little bit relaxed for Afghans because, it's pretty clear that there's a humanitarian crisis that's impacting nearly the entire population of the country at this point. But the affidavit of support requirement is there. And unless you had someone here or knew someone here, I mean, I guess it's possible that some US citizens might want to do that for people. But the problem is that the requirements are strict that if the person does become a public charge, and again, if the person were to get asylum later, they're not going to become a public charge because the rules are relaxed for asylees as to being able to get government benefits, right, for a certain period of time if they're granted asylum. But if for some reason someone doesn't apply for asylum, that could be a liability for the person that signs the affidavit of support. And so it's a tough one. I mean, I'd encourage people to do it if they're willing to kind of realistically face the consequences, right, of that. And if there's a way to do it, maybe through a nonprofit that's trying to hook people up who want to do that with people. But there's always, some risk in doing these things because you don't know, particularly if you don't know the people. And really the idea is that you're supposed to know the person, right, too. So you're sponsoring someone that you know and are willing to vouch for, right? Kind of personally and also support if necessary. So I haven't heard yet if any organizations are trying to hook up people that are willing, but you do have to provide 3 years of, your tax information and your social security number. And I don't know if many people want to do that in the age of identity theft. They'd probably rather help another way.
Well, it seems that there is a scramble for of people just, trying to get out. I mean, as we've seen, I mean, going to really desperate measures, risking their lives to get out of the country,
Mhm.
which just makes me so sad. I can't even imagine what that's must be like, because I feel like in America we're so insulated and a bit spoiled. But my heart really breaks for the people that do want to leave, that are trying to leave, and I'm trying to understand what are their options there, and what must life be like for them trying to leave, because it sounds easy, like, okay, I'm just going to pick up the phone and I'm going to call Jessica Smith Bobadilla and she's going to help me, but it's not always that easy.
Right.
And it sounds like from what you're saying that it's especially difficult if you don't have somebody here in the US that's helping you.
It could be very difficult, I think, to accomplish this if you don't have some connection to someone here. I'm helping someone that's a college student with a few cases for people that he knows there. His origins are there, and he's helped them, kind of guide them along. And he'll ask certain questions, and I answer what I know, and can. Obviously, this is changing as we speak, but I think that there's some people like that are Afghan Americans or that are, and there's nonprofits working on this, but there's only so many nonprofits. And after the Trump years and the whole age of child detention, I mean, a lot of these nonprofits were very overloaded to begin with. So now to try to integrate, these this type of thing, if they're immigration nonprofits, if they're even attempting to, and then other refugee organizations too, obviously have been dealing with a number of different crises. The caravans and all of those people too that have been at U.S. Mexico border and all the issues there. So it's kind of a time when maybe even more so than in the past, a lot of organizations are at capacity or overloaded already that do this type of work.
Yeah, I mean, I think because I've been visible here with you, I've had a lot of friends and colleagues ask me, what can I do to help? And I really don't know what to tell them. What I do is I just give money to organizations that I trust and that I think are doing good work. The two that I found are Women for Afghan Women and Too Young to Wed. And I've given money to them, and I encourage other people to do that as well. Is there any other organization that you trust that you could recommend, or anything else that you could recommend that people who want to help could do?
Um, I think that there's a number of refugee organizations throughout the country that are doing the work, of trying to get these special visas and other and humanitarian parole for people. There's not particularly one that I think, the problem is you hear different things from different people. I think there is one that's particularly devoted to Afghan issues or more devoted to Afghan issues, but I don't know their work personally. And so I'm always not 100% willing to like fully endorse. I would say that, any organization that does refugee work, if, particularly if you've heard that they're reputable, if you contact them and are sure they're working on Afghanistan and are sure that you want your money to go to that type of work, they'll generally do that. And in terms of, general, there's a lot of advocacy organizations that have been reporting on the Taliban for a long time. I think it's also not a bad idea just to try to support. I mean, most of the human rights defenders are going to have to get asylum or humanitarian parole or special visa of some type, but, I think that as much as we can still support those people doing their work as much as they can from outside, right? Because they probably have contact with people on the inside. It's also very important because part of what regimes like the Taliban do is that they shut down a lot of communication, so we could not even know things, right, until years later. I've also heard that the Taliban are very technologically savvy, and some of the forums that have been communicating with other lawyers and advocates in have encouraged that if we're sending emails to clients to send them through an encrypted platform because they're afraid that there would be possibility that people, particularly important people, but just maybe other people also could be targeted if the Taliban or their agents find certain things out. There was also reports of some people getting texts that looked like a visa or looked like something, and then it was, uncovered that they were not, actual documents, that it was some kind of a phishing attempt, either to trap people and ambush them, or it may have been a scam to extract money. I didn't get more information from that source. The other kind of weird reports we've heard was that there was one report through, we heard through one of the forums that the guards at the, or whoever was at the Pakistan border, I don't know if it was Taliban or if it was Pakistani guards, were taking Venmo for bribes to get across. And I don't know if that was true, but I was kind of like blown away if that was true. But, that often is an element of what goes on here because people get very desperate to get out, and there's often a price that people pay, and it gets harder and harder to get out, as I said last time, in most regimes. My first instinct to anyone that talked to me was get them out of the country, and unless they're in a country where they're also in danger for some reason, we're going to be in a better position because we'll be sure that they can get to the next country if they can't settle there, right?
Yeah.
And it turns out that it's become increasingly difficult to get on a plane or even to get to the airport in many circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, we can see that just from the news. What are you hearing, if anything, in your circles? Because you're an immigration attorney, so you would, kind of have your ear to the ground on these things. Are there rumblings of anything to sort of help the Afghan citizens and make it a little easier for them to have some basis to come to the country or not? And I guess related to that is, are you hearing anything from the Biden administration about that?
Um, did you say at first, was it that, are we hearing from Afghan citizens that it's getting any easier to get out
Well,
or?
now, are you hearing any rumblings in your professional community about, any mechanisms that could be implemented as a result of what's happening in Afghanistan that could kind of supplement the laws that we have already in place?
Yeah, I think most of us at this point are more reactive that are in the forums. We're all trying to file one or advise, people who are filing, for their relatives, one or more or multiple. And just the time frame is so quick because there's also a lot of uncertainty. It looks like the US will have to stick to the August 31st withdrawal, which is tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
And so after tomorrow, it doesn't mean that if the person was in a third country, that these immigration options that we've discussed for Afghan nationals go away. But that's my concern. It could become increasingly hard for people to get out of the country after the US withdraws. And my understanding was that there was interest in extending the timeline, but the Taliban made clear to the US that that's not going to happen.
All right. Well, is there anything else that you would want to share with us? I always rely on you to not necessarily me to ask the right questions, but you for you to tell me what I may have missed.
Um, well, I mean, I guess if you want to volunteer services, there's usually organizations that are doing this work in most major cities and other places. I think obviously monetary donations would help, including I think that there's a kind of a campaign to get together those humanitarian parole filing fees because a family of five would have to file 575 per person, which is a lot, right? And then there's FedEx fees. We're not going to send this regular mail if it's this type of emergency. There's also efforts going on to try to connect people with refugee organizations in third countries if they end up there. And so if people have connections with third country governments, particularly those that might not have to be bordering, obviously, but they could just be like in the region generally, or even somewhere near. I mean, that could help us facilitate, if people can get out, some kind of exit to certain countries, because everyone can't go to Pakistan, right? The Pakistani government's going to send them back eventually if there's too many people. And so it's more an idea of getting them to the next, like kind of like a leap pad or something, right? So they
Yeah.
can eventually get to the US or a country that they have family, or that they are would be safe and, able to resettle without risk.
Well, if you know of any organizations like that, maybe not at this particular moment, but in the future, let me know and I'll post them. I'll share them with our
Yeah,
audience.
we can try to get a list. I just wanna be sure that they're all reputable, because you hear different things, and not
Mhm.
having worked all over the country. I've worked on the East Coast and West Coast, but there's a lot in between, and, I just wanna be sure that I'm giving a list that then people don't come back and say, that there was some problem. Yeah.
I agree totally. And, the two that I've referenced, I mean, I don't personally know anybody there, but they seem to have gotten a lot of attention in the media recently, and a lot of public figures have vouched for them. So,
Mhm.
sort of at a loss as to who to give to. So I was willing to take my chances and accept that they were good ones. But I'm always open to other suggestions as to how to help, because I'm actually feeling very small right now.
Yeah. And the American Immigration Lawyers Association, they have another sub branch called AIC. I believe if people want to contact them, it's AILA.org and AIC.org. I think that they will be sure that whatever area you're in, that you either, if you want to volunteer or you want to make a monetary donation, if you don't want to do it through them, I think they're coordinating a lot of efforts and trying to get these filing fees covered, and pro bono attorneys, on the right cases too. But if you want to contact them, they should be able to also help connect with resources. You can also contact me. Probably through the podcast email is best, so it doesn't get mixed up with my own casework. But I am attorney Jessica podcast at gmail.com is a good email address for me, and we can try to connect you with someone in your area, depending if you want to volunteer. Some people have language skills that may be helpful, like if people that are Iranian Americans speak Farsi, many Afghans speak a variation of Farsi, so there could be things like that that some people can help with too. Or it could just be that maybe you have some skill that could help an organization, right? That's data oriented or tech oriented, right? I assume they're trying to migrate and collect a lot of data and manage it, and they probably have people doing that for them, but maybe not to the degree this quickly as to what is required here to pull together a lot of information.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate this. And I would really like to continue this dialogue. And, you kind of tell me when it's time to update our conversation and have you on again.
Okay, that sounds great, Christina. Thank you for having me again.
Of course. And I will have all of the organizations that you referenced in the comments. So if anybody's watching this, maybe you're watching the replay, just go to the comments and you'll see all of those resources there. So thank you for watching. And thank you, Jessica.
Thank you, Christina, for having me again.